Hello and welcome back to Weston the Historian. Today I want to be talking about the history of immigration in America. I was asked in a previous video where I was talking about old stock Americans, someone was asking me to talk about the different types of Americans based on when their ancestors came, and funnily enough, when they asked for that, I was already working on the script for this. So today I want to be talking about this. So, the history of immigration in America. Let's just start at the beginning of America, which is 1776. There was very little immigration. All the way up until 1830, there was almost no immigration. A lot of the founding fathers, specifically Ben Franklin and Hamilton, off the top of my head, were pretty against immigration, or at the very least warned against it to an extent. And when John Adams was president, he pretty much banned immigration during his brief presidency. But the majority of the country were descended from British colonists who were not immigrants. They were pioneers and they were settlers, which is a bit of a different thing. That is different. To explain, a colonist is someone who goes into a new land and claims it for a certain country. So British colonists are going into this land that they hadn't been to before, and they're claiming it for Britain. Or they're exploring this land and they're starting settlements there. That is what colonization is. That's settling. That is conquest. That is not how immigration works. Immigration is when you leave your country for a whole different country that's already settled and already up and at it, basically. So while a British colonist would be leaving Britain, coming to a new land, claiming it for Britain, settling it, cultivating it, an immigrant would be someone who comes from, let's say, Germany, and they come and live in that settlement with these people who are not German. So that's the difference. I wanted to get that out of the way. So for the vast majority of people were the descendants of British colonists. So that's English, that's Scottish, that's Scotch-Irish, Irish, Welsh, Cornish, whatnot. There were also, of course, black slaves. There were Dutch colonists in New York who also weren't really immigrants because they had created a colony in New York that just got absorbed into the rest of the British colonies. And then, however, there were, in fact, immigrants from France, mostly Huguenots, that is, French Protestants, as well as Germany and Sweden and some other Scandinavian countries. And the vast majority of these people, immigrant or not, were Protestant, including the Irish. So that was anywhere between 1776 and 1830. By around 1830, we get a pretty big wave of immigrants from Britain, Ireland, specifically Catholic Irish people, and the Germans. So a lot of them are laborers and artisans, and for the most part, they went to cities, but a lot of the Germans went to the Midwest or Texas, and they would work as farmers. And of course, with a huge wave of immigration, you'll naturally see a rise in nativism to counteract that. So you see this rise in nativism, which is targeted at Catholics, and for the most part, the Irish, not so much the British and the Germans, though of course they do also bear some of that. So something interesting is you also see along religious lines, you see them start taking sides politically. So you see Catholic and Lutheran immigrants, for the most part, become Democrat, while other Protestants end up becoming Republican. Now, these immigrants fought on both sides of the Civil War. You would see British, Irish, Germans on the Union, and you'd see them in the Confederacy. They fought on both sides. Then during these decades, immigration just rapidly increased So it went from like around 8,000 to over 1 million, which is a lot for 2 decades. Um, so it's natural to see the rise in nativism during this time. Um, so it really spurred this rise in immigration was the Irish Great Famine and the failed 1848 revolutionaries. So basically, in Ireland, Great Potato Famine. A lot of the harvest just doesn't work. A lot of people start dying. They leave for America. In 1848, just this whole year of revolution. So in Germany specifically, there was a lot of liberals trying to create a German republic, a united German republic, and these revolutions failed. And a lot of these failed revolutionaries just came to America. Many of them fought for the Union, and even as pretty high-ranking like generals and whatnot. Um, then, also during this period, the end of the Mexican-American War saw tens of thousands of Mexicans living in incorporated areas like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, all of a sudden become U.S. citizens. And then the California Gold Rush also attracted people from all over Latin America. It attracted other Europeans. It attracted the Chinese. It attracted Australians. And during this period, the native-born population dropped from 98% to 90%. And the Protestant population dropped from 95% to 90% as well. So then, after this, going from 1850 to 1930, so during the Civil War, during World War One, what we see is the Germans basically take over the Midwest. We see a lot more Germans come in, and most of them go over to the Midwest. Um, a lot of the immigrants during this period were young men from 15 to 30 looking for cheap jobs. So we see 25 million Europeans, we see Jews, we see Italians, we see the Greeks, Hungarians, Poles, Russians, other Slavs, etc., etc. And almost all of them came to cities and worked in industrial jobs. And a lot of them would return to their country of origin. Strangely enough, about half of the southern Italians that came in during this period would return to Italy. Um, and then we see a new wave of nativism, of course, which was also charged at Catholics, and they tried to push Congress to restrict immigration. But before the Civil War, there wasn't a lot of success with this. But after the Civil War in 1875, Congress passed the Asian Exclusion Act, and then in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So they pretty much they were they started being very very strict on who could come in from Asia, and they basically banned anyone from China. Um, and something interesting is before 1890, individual states had their own immigration laws. 1910s, we see Italians start coming in, or really rapidly coming in. We see about 2 million of them come in, and then, as I said, half of them leave. Then we see more Swedes and Norwegians come in, and they also go to the Midwest. And we see the Lebanese and Syrians settle all over New York, Boston, Detroit, and also the Midwest. Um, and in 1917, a literacy requirement was added, uh, which made it a lot harder for people who couldn't get an education in Europe or Asia or wherever else to enter America. And then Emergency Quota Act 1921, the Immigration Act of 1924. These basically made it so that no more than 2% of all Asian nationalities could enter in the country. So once again, very, very strict on Asian immigration. And then the 1920s saw a lot more restrictive laws. Immigration actually dropped during this period. Immigrants from Western, Northern, and Central Europe were preferred over pretty much anyone else. But what is kind of strange is that during this whole time of immigration in America, Latin American immigration was mostly left out of the conversation. People from Latin America could come in with relative ease. It wasn't really that difficult to go from South America or Mexico or Central America to the United States. It was just not that difficult. It was not something that was discussed. And during this period, we actually saw hundreds of thousands of Mexicans who were fleeing civil war, corruption, and poverty come to America. So now, moving on from 1930 to 2000, so this period is going from World War II to the Cold War. We see in between the 30s and the 60s, a lot of the restrictions were dropped, and they were allowing a lot of refugees and broadening the scope of who could be labeled as a refugee. So naturalization became easier with the Equal Nationality Act of 1934. And during the 30s, we see a lot of 30s, 40s, and 50s, we see a lot of Jews fleeing Nazi Germany, Eastern Europeans and Hungarians fleeing communism, and Cubans fleeing after the revolution come to America. In 1945, at the end of World War II, we see the War Brides Act, which allowed wives of U.S. soldiers to enter, and eventually this was extended to fiancés. After World War II, American women would go back to their jobs as housewives, as the jobs that they temporarily occupied were replaced by returning soldiers and new immigrants. And in 1950, communists were banned from immigrating to America. And during this, we also see a lot of Koreans come in during the Korean War. And immigration is still limited. Refugee status is opened up to non-Europeans, though. And then Operation Wetback forced illegal Mexicans to go back to Mexico. And in 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which eliminated racial preference in immigration. And of course, during the 60s, we also see a rise in Filipino immigration. And the 70s, with the Vietnam War, we see a lot of Vietnamese people come in. And, we now see a pretty big popularity in Vietnamese food in America as a result of the rise in Vietnamese immigrants during the 70s. And then in 1986, we see the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which penalized any sort of company or business who employed illegal immigrants. And then in 1996, we see the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, which further limited immigration by restructuring the process of admitting and deporting immigrants. And this cut down refugee status, expanded border control, and it allowed Attorney General more authority in migration. So, ever since then, immigration has continued to be a pretty controversial subject that's seen constant revision in American policy. Typically, what we see is it loosens under Democrats and is more restrictive under Republicans. And of course, that's like a 4 to 8 year period. So, for 4 to 8 years, immigration policy is just totally different. And because it also flip flops all the time, because what we tend to see is a Democrat gets elected and then a Republican gets elected and then a Democrat gets elected. So it's just this whole weird cycle of changing policy. But anyway, so going back, I do want to talk and go back. So if we're talking about the different groups of Americans who, based on when they came, before 1776, that would be old stock Americans. Then everything from 1776 to 1830, we could call that first wave migrants. Then anyone in between 1830 and 1950, or 1850, sorry, we could also call them like second wave. 1850 to 1930, we could say that's Ellis Islanders. It's a lot of people who came in through Ellis Island, which is just this whole time period when you see a lot of immigration. And yeah, I think Ellis Islander is probably the most appropriate term to use. And then anyone between 1930 and 2000, that's, I guess, fourth wave of immigrants. And yeah, so that's all I really wanted to talk about today. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this was concise and informative. And if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. And thank you and goodbye.